Hey everyone, it's Chrono from the Headphone Show. So it's been a while since I actually sat down to listen to a set of IEMs. I think the last pair I listened to was actually the Biodynamic and Acetylene Current T9 IE, and I reviewed those almost a year ago. I think it was like July or August of 2021. I didn't film a video on them, but I wrote an article, so if you're interested in that, put a link in the description down below, as it's on headphones.com. But anyways, that's not what I'm here to talk about today, because this week I've actually been spending quite a bit of time with what I think is one of the hottest IEMs in the market right now, and that is the Audio Monarch Mark II. Let's check these out. Okay, so Mark II, as the name would suggest, means that this is a follow-up model to the also immensely popular Monarch Tribrid IEM from Audio. Now, something very interesting is that the original one retails for $730, I believe, whereas this one actually comes in at $999, so $1,000, a pretty significant price increase. Now, in this review, I'll be mainly sharing my experience with the Monarch Mark II, but I'll also be drawing some comparisons to the original Monarch Mark I, which I actually have with me, as well as the V16 Divinity, which is Audio's $1,500 flagship. So, as always, we'll start off by checking out the accessories. Packed alongside the Monarch Mark II are quite a few goodies. For starters, there are the included tips, with 3 sets of silicone tips and 3 sets of foam tips, ranging from small to large sizes. Also included is a travel case that, although not particularly pocketable, is still compact and easy to travel with. As for the included cable, you still get Audio's OCC silver-plated cable. However, unlike the original Monarch's cable, which was coated in rubber, this one uses a paracord braid and is more flexible and easier to work with. Lastly, there are the new Smart Switch adapters, which allow you to swap between 3.5mm single-ended and both 2.5 and 4.4mm balanced terminations for the cable. Moving on to comfort, the Monarch Mark II is a beautiful looking IEM that also feels premium and well built. However, I have to note that it's definitely on the larger side for IEMs. In this regard, it's similar to the original Monarch, which had a rather large chassis and one that I personally found difficult to wear for extended periods of time due to the size alone. This may be because I have fairly small ears, but it's something to keep in mind, as I personally don't find the chassis here to be as well contoured as on something like the Juno S86 or even as on the V16 Divinity, also large IEMs. So overall, I wouldn't say that the Monarch Mark II is one of the more comfortable IEMs I've tried. As far as the ear tips go though, I found both the silicone and foam tips to fit very comfortably, and once I actually determined which size was best for me, getting a solid seal was no problem at all. But now let's talk about what's most important, and that is sound. So as I mentioned earlier, the original Monarch was a Tribrid IEM, and the Mark II follows suit as it is powered by a 10mm Sonian dynamic driver, 6 Knowles balanced armature drivers, and 2 Sonian electrostatic drivers. Right off the bat, I'll say that, at least for me personally, the Monarch Mark II has a more balanced and more natural sounding tonality than that of the original Monarch. And, I actually really enjoyed the original Monarch, but it did have like this sort of sub-bass emphasis. And it didn't intrude into other frequency ranges because it did settle pretty early. It was like around 120 Hertz. However, at least for me, it did make the IEM feel sort of bass heavy. And then it also had like this prominent peak at 8K that did introduce a little bit of mid-treble sibilance, and it just made the treble feel like somewhat unnaturally over-brightened. Now, I feel like both of those things have been addressed in the Monarch Mark II. However, as much as I've enjoyed this new version of the IEM, it's not without its flaws, and as we'll talk about briefly, it does have its own quirks, particularly in the treble region. But let's talk first about the bass. So I mentioned that the bass have been reworked and slightly toned down compared to the original Monarch, but that doesn't mean that in any way is the Mark II lacking in bass presence. For the most part, the difference lies in the sub-bass region, which seems to have less of a swell to it and as a result feels less boomy. Aside from that change, really, the overall shape and size of the Monarch's bass response seems unchanged, and despite the bass shelf under 120 Hz being perhaps a bit more generous than I personally like in the level of bass that it provides, the tuning here is a very enjoyable one. Low tones are clean, yet powerful. Just for a quick comparison to the Divinity's bass response, so I actually think I prefer the Monarch Mark II's bass response over that of the Divinities, and that's because the Divinities, the bass shelf sort of stretches a bit past 120 hertz, so it actually provides a bass boost, a mid-bass boost of sorts. So what you get is it does enhance the, let's say, like the low-end impact of bass tones on the Divinity, but they don't feel quite as defined as on the Monarch Mark II. Moving along to the mids, the mid-range is definitely the section of the frequency response where I think that the audio got it right on both the original Monarch and on the Mark II. I don't think it was quite as noticeable on the original due to the emphasis on both the bass and the treble, but the tuning here on the Mark II for the mid-range is really even throughout and has an organic voicing. Instrument and vocal tones have got a rich body to them, and their embellishing overtones are well contoured in the upper mid-range. Now, I will note that 3K was perhaps a tiny bit forward, but not enough to where I'd say that the Monarch Mark II is an outright shouty sounding IEM. All in all, there's really no complaints from me in the mid-range. I think that it sounds great, and it's one of the greatest qualities of the Monarch Mark II. As for the highs, the treble region is where I feel mixed about the Mark II. It doesn't have as strong of an 8K peak as the original Monarch, but to me, the highs on the Mark II just feel more uneven. So, as opposed to one large peak like you had on the original, I felt as though there were different spots in the treble that were boosted. The most prominent and most noticeable one for me was a slight bump at around 5.5 to 6K, which introduced some low treble sibilance, a bit of glare, and also gave the Monarch Mark II a very slightly nasally or like metallic timbral quality. Then there was also a slight bump again at 8K, which, although nowhere near as present as the one on the original Monarch, did still contribute to the Mark II feeling a little sibilant in the mid-treble region. One aspect of the highs that did improve from the original model to this new one, I think, is that the Mark II seems to have better extended treble. It doesn't feel as airy as the V16 Divinity, but it definitely does feel more present in the upper treble region above 10K than the original Monarch. But anyways, let's now talk about technical performance, and as always, we'll start off with resolution. So for detail retrieval, I feel like the Mark II delivers excellent performance, but at least for me, I'm not sure if it's there for that $999 price tag. It left me a little bit disappointed because compared to one of my favorite IEMs, the Juno SA6, yes, there is an improvement when you go to the Mark II from the SA6. But it's not really an almost $500 difference. And in fact, I personally didn't really see much of an upgrade in this regard when going from the Mark I to the Mark II. So whilst yes, it does create a clean and nuanced image of the music, I'm not really sure if it's hitting the mark for the price bracket that this new model is coming in at. For soundstage imaging and layering, given that it's an IEM, the Monarch Mark II soundstage presentation is forward and intimate. Nonetheless, I actually found it to be quite enjoyable. It has some of the best instrument separation and layering I've heard on an IEM yet. Assisted by its fairly accurate imaging, all instrument and vocal lines are well distinguished, and they do a great deal in enhancing the Mark II's sense of overall clarity. Then lastly, we have dynamics, and for dynamics, I think that the Monarch Mark II delivers very good performance for an IEM. I suppose that it's not really that surprising since it does feature a dynamic driver, but I think it's still very nice to mention that the low tones do get a nice sense of punch and slam on the Monarch, whilst also delivering a satisfying snap and attack in the upper registers. It just makes for an engaging listen. Okay, so now to wrap up this review on the Monarch Mark II, and I have to say that it's a very solid IEM. I do think that, at least in its tonality, it does improve over the original. In fact, I think that it's one of the best tonalities that I've heard in an IEM thus far. I actually like it even more than the tuning that you get on the V16 Divinity. Still, even though it has excellent technical performance, even though I enjoy it a lot, I really struggle to recommend the Mark II, the Monarch Mark II at its $999 price point. You know, paying almost $500 more than what you would for the SA6, or you know, $300 more than you would for the original Monarch, I just don't feel like you're really getting the value there for the additional money that you're spending. So I feel as though, at least in terms of pricing, the Monarch Mark II is in a bit of an awkward spot. Sure, it's a great IEM, but I know that I personally wouldn't stretch to get the Monarch over something like an SA6, and I definitely wouldn't recommend Mark I owners to upgrade to the Mark II because, well, tuning aside, there's not really a significant upgrade there. I hope that in the future the Monarch Mark II comes down in price, ideally closer to the price point of the original as opposed to its current one, but for now, I'd suggest passing on this one. Anyways, that is all for me today. I hope you enjoyed this video or found it useful. If you did, do consider dropping a like. And if you'd like to learn more about the Monarch Mark II or many other headphones, I highly encourage you to check out the review section available on headphones.com. For more headphone nerdy content, stay tuned by subscribing to The Headphone Show here on YouTube. And until next time, this is Chrono signing off.